All right. If you'll come back. When we move into the accountable leadership model, there are 4 functions in the life of your congregation. One of them is the role of governing. The role of governing is the responsibility of the board or your council, this new leadership team, the simplified structure. In accountable leadership, the role of the pastor is leading. Leading. That does not say doing, that says leading. Staff, both paid and unpaid, think of this as ministry team leaders. Their role is managing. And the role of your members, regular attenders, is ministering. Now, see, we've gotten ourselves into some trouble in some churches because we've hired our ministry to be done for us. We become too staff and pastor dependent, which has disempowered laity. So it has allowed us to build generations now, 2, almost 3, of what I refer to with all the love and grace of pew potatoes. Because just as long as I come and I worship for an hour, I'm good. Because we haven't discipled folks. We've allowed them to consider that that's what a disciple looks like. That's on us. But this is where we get into this accountable leadership model, is that it is all helping us make disciples, which means that we need to equip our people to be disciple makers. Do you see where everything begins to start coming together, that we're all rowing in the same direction when we get our mission at the focus and the very purpose for what we're doing? You see, the staff is hired or recruited to equip the congregation to do ministry. We've done ourselves a disservice when we hire staff to do the ministry. So one of the things to shift out of is to begin to look at our roles a little differently. Board to govern, pastor to lead, staff to manage or equip, and the members to actually do the ministry. So if we were to play on a football team, here's a metaphor for you to kind of help think about this in a different way. So if we were playing a game of football, the members or those regular attenders would be thought of as the team. That's your team. They outreach first to others, and then we care for one another secondarily. Their role, once again, is ministry. Think of our staff as our managers and equippers. So their role is to equip and coordinate. Think of them as your assistant coaches or your specialty coaches. The pastor has the role of leadership. It's all around vision and direction and teaching. Think of your pastor as your head coach or the quarterback or perhaps even the captain of the team. Then the role of the board is to govern. They function around accountability and support. Think of them as perhaps the commissioner or the umpire, the scorekeeper, and maybe even the cheerleaders. Here are the strengths of the accountable leadership model. It certainly marries the responsibility and authority with accountability more than any other model will do. It promotes church unity. How does it do that? Because everybody's on the same page, rowing in the same direction. We get to the point of we know what our purpose is. It has to function on a high level of trust, which means the board has to work at building that trust with intentionality. Decisions are made very quickly, much like the world operates. Mission and vision fulfillment is why we exist. It's the driving force, not management, not maintenance of our church. The goals and the objectives of ministry can be adjusted as needed. So that means we're not doing things just to be doing things. We're doing things because it helps us live into God's preferred future of how we specifically make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Here's a pastor's role in accountable leadership. The pastor is the spiritual leader or shepherd, the keeper of the mission, the caster of the vision, an example of an evangelist. So that means we have to give him the opportunity to do that. So if you are in a church that is expecting your pastor to keep office hours, you might be working against the very thing that they might be needing to do. You see, because asking them to keep particular office hours is about us wanting to keep our finger on our pastor, as opposed to free our pastor to say, go and do what we're asking you to do to reach new people and model that for us. Because if your pastor isn't bringing in new people, how are we expecting our people in the pews to bring in new people as well? They are the chief fundraiser, which means it's important for our pastors to know the giving. And I know some of you are going to push back on that, but you know what? When your pastor knows the giving, it is helpful to know where people are in their spiritual walk. There are things to celebrate when giving changes, and there are concerns, and it's pastoral care when things change. And wouldn't it be important for your pastor, who is the chair of the nominations committee, to know who is tithing when we look at leaders? Refer back to my previous example where we had a finance chair who had not been in attendance, let alone given a dime to the church in 5 years. The main recruiter of staff, both paid and unpaid, and their role is to develop leaders, staff, board, and new leadership. All right, we're going to spend some time here trying to unpack this organizational chart. All right? If we were living into simplified structure, this is what the organizational chart could look like in your church. All right? At the very top of your church is the big JC. We have to remember that. It would not be us. It's Christ's church, not our church. And the primary beneficiary are those that aren't here yet. Not us. And we sometimes lose focus of that. We're the organization that exists most primarily for our members that are not our membership, but those that aren't yet here. We have to remember that. Now, the board, I want you all to hear that. The board is accountable to Christ. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about getting to the pearly gates and being asked, how did you lead my church? How were you faithful in leading my church to reach new people? Kind of changes the focus a little bit, doesn't it? When we really think about that accountability. And again, the role is governance. Under that is the pastor. And the pastor is accountable to the board for the mission, the vision, and the particular goals of the year. Now, do you see the dotted line to the right? Nominations. Friends, the board cannot be self-nominating. You must have a separate nominations committee by book of discipline. Okay? Just like your board has years, okay, classes. So if you were going to start accountable leadership, simplified structure in 2018, you would have 3 classes. The class of 18, the class of 19, and the class of 20, with approximately 1/3 in each class. The same is true of nominations. You need 3 classes. The pastor is still, just like he or she has always been in the Book of Discipline, is still the chair of that nominations process. But the board cannot be self-nominating. You must have a separate nominations committee, okay? So remember when I said thinking about going from how many committees that you have now down to 2? These are the 2, the board and nominations. And I shorten that name, and that probably doesn't do it justice, and I think because we shorten it, we forget its functions. But it's nominations and lay leadership development. You see, that's the problem, is we have forgotten that that's the responsibility of nominations. Because that's another one of those things where we just say, oh, well, you just got to work a month or 2 a year, to get people to say yes. But the true function of nominations and lay leadership development is developing leaders. And have we called them into accountability around that? Then under the pastor is your staff. Now, these are thought of as team leaders, and it could be hired staff. It could be maybe even volunteers. But they're still staff. And they're the ones that are responsible for ministry teams, okay? And this is where the teams come into play when you need them to do the ministry to accomplish the goals that you have already talked about accomplishing this year at your retreat, in your strategic planning. And this is where the strategies take place, is down there in the ministry teams. You see, the problem is we try to deal with strategies at the board level. And that's where we find ourselves managing rather than governing. Do you see how many layers are there between mission and objectives? There's 3 layers. But see, because we've been in a different model at the board level, we've been planning ministries. That's not our job. We've got to get some people who are thinking about accountability to Christ, of our church making disciples, of our church being missional, keeping our eye on the ball. Now, one of the things we talked about, and I think it was over here when we talked about trustees, and that's usually the biggest pushback when we start talking about simplifying structure and maybe only having 9 people on the board. And how do we have 9 trustees do all the work in addition to the other responsibilities of the board? You see, we have people who like to change light bulbs. And we have people who like to trim bushes or do odd jobs, do we not? God bless that we all have them in our church, yes? But friends, they're doing ministry. That's their ministry. They belong in a ministry team, a building maintenance ministry team, not as a trustee. And the guiding principles allow them the authority and the responsibility to carry that out at whatever level you as the board approve without having to come back. Right? The very people that like to do that kind of work are not the people who like to do the visionary and governing work. So think of that as one of your ministry teams. So maybe you have a children's coordinator, and the children's coordinator puts different teams together for different seasons of your children's ministry throughout the year. But maybe you don't have a standing children's ministry team. That way people can come and go at their leisure. They're shorter term commitments, which people are going to be more likely to think about. So here is just one example of what your organizational chart could look like. So the owner doesn't change. The big JC is still at the top. Then the board, pastor, nominations over to the side. And then perhaps your team leaders might be a family ministries coordinator and a director of worship and a director of mission and evangelism. Just go with it, okay? Maybe that's what it could look like. But you see, under the person who is your family ministries coordinator, there's maybe a children's team and there's a youth team, and there's a college-age team. Under your director of worship, you might have the choir and the praise team and the worship design team. And then under your director of mission and evangelism, you might have your mission team, bridge building team, and your hospitality team. So I want you to spend some time at your table. I want you, with your church, to sketch out a rough draft of what the organizational chart might look like in your church. Now, just beginning stages, right? But what could it look like if you go to simplified structure? This piece is going to take some work. And please know that underneath the pastor, where you have staff and ministry teams, it may change from time to time. That's where the flexibility comes in and should be to help you flex with the changing goals or maybe even a changing vision from time to time. So know that Jesus Christ, the board, the pastor, and nominations is set. But everything under there can ebb and flow depending on your vision and your goals of the year. Does that make sense? Okay? So this is a piece that I want you, if you are getting ready to move into this model, make sure that you have this piece put into place before you start practicing it. If you're practicing it and you don't have it, you need to start there and figure this out. Because you see, when we don't have a very clear organizational chart, it's really hard to tell how the decision-making happens. Right? Can you see that? Who's responsible to who? Who do I report to? And so on.